Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx and to who is now joining us on Facebook Live. The Geneva Environment Network and the International Union for Conservation of Nature have the pleasure to welcome you today virtually for the third session of the Geneva Dialogues on Nature-Based Solutions. The event today will focus on the post-2020 biodiversity framework. As you will hear from our guests and from our moderator, the Nature-Based Solutions Dialogues aimed to facilitate further engagement and discussion among the stakeholders in international Geneva and beyond in the lead up to a critical year for nature and society. Our nature-based solution journey is co-convened with IUCN. IUCN has its headquarters in our region and is an essential global actor, bringing together the world's most influential organizations and experts to conserve nature and accelerate the transition to a sustainable world. We have again the pleasure to have some leading experts from the network with us today. Before I give the floor to Dr. Jane Smart, Global Director of the Biodiversity Conservation Group and the Global Species Program at IUCN, who will guide you through our session today, let me briefly mention for those who wouldn't yet know the Geneva Environment Network that we are a network of more than 100 institutions and secretariats based in Geneva that make this region one of the global hubs for environmental governance. Administrated by the United Nations Environment Programme and supported by Switzerland, we organize various networking activities, including regular multi-stakeholder roundtables and briefings on major environmental trends. Let me also remind you that the documents presented today, the summary, as well as the video of the dialogue, will be made available on the webpage of this event. With this, Jane, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Diana, and welcome from me too to this special dialogue on nature-based solutions in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This is a very timely dialogue, given that we have a key negotiation meeting for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework coming up. And the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, of course, is eliciting a lot of excitement around the world right now, because along with health and climate change, which are also on everybody's minds, biodiversity is the third piece of this extremely important puzzle, absolutely essential to propping up our life support systems. So as I just mentioned, the open-ended working group is coming up. It comes up in late August, on the 23rd of August, so quite soon really. And just after that, we head into IUCN's World Conservation Congress. So it is indeed very timely. Before I proceed with a few more remarks on nature-based solutions, I just wanted to mention I'm going to introduce the panel a little bit later on, but we do have apologies from one of our panelists, Lucy Malenkai, Executive Director of the Indigenous Information Network, and also from David Cooper, who's replaced by Catalina Santamaria, and we're delighted to welcome her. So I will just say a little bit more about nature-based solutions, and then, as I say, you will hear from our panelists. So if I could have my slide, please, Diana. And the next one, please. Thank you very much. So just a few remarks that I think and believe will be picked up by our panelists. We're going to be looking at how nature-based solutions could contribute to the finally adopted post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which, after all, must succeed in halting the net loss of biodiversity by 2030. That's certainly IUCN's position, so that it can truly contribute to the vision by 2050 of living in harmony with nature. Now, nature-based solutions are a phrase, I think, with real resonance, and I think that's why they've been picked up as a phrase all around the world and in all sorts of venues. It's just one of those phrases that when you hear it, you remember it really. And at the same time, there's quite a little bit of discussion and even controversy around the phrase, which I hope we're going to get to today in our discussions. It's been mentioned in the recent IPBES meeting and in the recent virtual CBD meetings, and I'm sure, as I say, we'll hear more about that. And I think, it's very good that it's been picked up and is being discussed, because it means that people will, I think, remember it. But at the same time, there's a downside to that interest in it, because we've got to make sure people use it in the right way and don't misuse it, actually, because that's really not helpful. But from the IUCN point of view, we do see it as a key piece of the puzzle for ensuring sustainable large-scale protection and restoration of nature. And it can benefit both people and nature from a biodiversity conservation point of view. It's grounded in the ecosystem approach, as one of our speakers is going to talk about. And I should say that the global standard for nature-based solutions was adopted just last year to provide robust environmental and biodiversity safeguards in relation to nature and indeed human rights. And it guarantees, if applied properly and correctly, fair and inclusive governance and decision making, which is of real relevance to the post-2020 framework. It can relate to all three objectives of the CB, not just conservation. And going back to 2016, IUCN's World Conservation Congress in Hawaii, we adopted a recognized definition through a resolution which was actually adopted by our state and NGO members at that meeting. And here's one key point I want to make, that there are 8 criteria, as you will hear, but number 3 addresses net positive impact on biodiversity. If applied correctly, the result will always be net positive. And I really want to stress that point. And in so doing, of course, it will therefore contribute to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So now it is a great pleasure to introduce our speakers. I do have one more slide which shows you how it is currently well, there's the definition. There's our definition of nature-based solutions, and I'm sure our speakers will be showing this. And there's one more slide. You can just go to the next one because we'll come back to this definition. These highlighted in bold on this slide are the current mentions of nature-based solutions in the updated zero draft in relation to the actual 2030 action targets. The current updated zero draft is the current version of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, soon to be amended as a result of the recent sessions. The next, I'm sure Catalina is going to tell us from the CBD, but coming up in early to mid-July, we will have the next version, and we'll see what's happened to the whole concept of nature-based solutions there. But the current Target 7 contains a mention of nature-based solutions in relation to climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. I won't read out the whole target because you can see it there, and we're going to come back to this. Under the heading of reducing threats to biodiversity, under the heading of meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, Target 10 is aiming to ensure that nations by 2030 and the ecosystem approach contribute to regulation of air quality hazards and extreme events, and quality and quantity of water for at least, and then we have a certain number of people in square brackets. But this is a draft post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and there's a long way to go before we get to the final framework. Thank you. And many of our panelists will be elaborating on these points. So I think that's it with the PowerPoint. And let me now introduce the panelists. I'm going to introduce them all at the beginning, and then I'll introduce them one by one as they make their interventions. So it is a great pleasure, firstly, to introduce Catalina Santamaria, who's Special Advisor to the Executive Secretary of the UN CBD. Thank you very much for joining us, Catalina. We're looking forward to hearing about all the updates on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, nature-based solutions. Norbert Barlocker is head Rio Conventions section of the Federal Office for the Environment in Switzerland. Picture to come up. Well. Okay, I'm going to carry on. We'll hear from Camilla Zipada Lizama, Director General of Global Issues at the Mexican Secretariat of Foreign Relations. And then we'll hear from Corley Pretorius, Deputy Director of one of our key partners, UNEP WCMC. And last but by no means least, one of the brains behind nature-based solutions in IUCN, Angela Andrade, Environmental Policy at Conservation International, and Chair of the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management. Now, these panelists have a very difficult task because they're going to make their in just 5 minutes each. And as we go through, please put your questions to our panelists in the chat. And what we'll be doing at the end of hearing from these 5 experts, we'll have a good open discussion. And obviously we want to allow a good time for discussion because this is such an interesting issue that's evoked such a lot of response and also questions, as I said earlier. So we'll have a good interactive dialogue going. So from the chat, so please do feel free to put your questions there, either in relation to a panelist in particular or more generally. And then finally, before we wrap up, on time, of course, we'll be asking each panelist to give their one key takeaway message that we'll all be remembering. Good, so that's what we've got ahead of us this afternoon. So with no more delay, let me ask Catalina Santa, working very close with the Executive Secretary to the CBD Executive Secretary, let me ask her for her intervention. And we're all fascinated to hear what she's going to say.
Thank you so much, Jane. It's a pleasure for us to be participating in this event, and we express our appreciation to the government of Switzerland, the Geneva Environmental Network, UNEP, IUCN for organizing this session, and to all the panelists and participants that are joining today. On behalf of Mr. David Cooper, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the CBD, it's a pleasure for me to share this update on the COP15 preparations and to contribute to the discussions on the role of nature-based solutions. 2 weeks ago, delegates to the CBD process concluded the first formal virtual part of negotiations under the subsidiary body meetings. This is a critical step in the lead up to COP15. Delegates not only advanced the work of the subsidiary bodies, but also produced important advice to the co-chairs of the working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Work will continue virtually in the 3rd meeting of the working group on the post-2020 framework that's scheduled for the 23rd of August to the 3rd of September. At that meeting, delegates will work on the basis of the first draft, currently being prepared by the co-chairs, which is building upon the earlier drafts and the discussions of SBSTA and SBI. It is anticipated that a physical meeting will be needed to complete the work of the working group and the subsidiary bodies before the final version of the framework being presented for adoption at COP15. The COP Bureau is meeting in the coming days to develop the timetable for this meeting and for plans for COP itself. Clearly, such plans will need to ensure effective preparation and convening of COP15 with full participation of all stakeholders. Now, turning to nature-based solutions, which is the main focus of today's discussion. As you are aware, nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches feature prominently in the discussions around the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and indeed are reflected in a number of draft targets in the Zero Draft and in the updated Zero Draft. And Jane, you referred to 2 of those in your slides. Nature-based solutions are often discussed in relation to climate change, and there's strong action to keep climate change well below 2 degrees Celsius and close to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We know this is needed to prevent climate impacts from overwhelming all other actions in support of biodiversity. Conservation and restoration of ecosystems can play a substantial role in these efforts. And as illustrated in the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, such nature-based solutions could provide about 1/3 of the total net emission reduction effort required to keep climate change close to 1.5 degrees Celsius. With the appropriate safeguards, they could also enhance a wide range of ecosystem services, including water infiltration, flood and coastal protection, and soil health, as well as contributing to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. However, there are four important caveats to use of nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches. Firstly, while they are an essential part of the solution, the climate problem cannot be solved without stringent reductions in the use of fossil fuels. Secondly, the distributional impacts must be considered, and Indigenous people and local communities must be fully involved in the development and implementation of ecosystem-based approaches. Thirdly, while many ecosystem-based approaches have co-benefits for biodiversity, this is not always the case, and careful assessment of synergies and trade-offs is required. In particular, tree planting is not always appropriate, especially non-native species in monoculture plantations. Fourthly, climate change impacts can undermine ecosystem resilience and thus weaken the contribution of ecosystems to both mitigation and adaptation of climate change. It is essential that these caveats be kept in mind and that only efforts that truly contribute to social objectives in a just manner while protecting biodiversity are counted as true nature-based solutions. Clearly, ecosystem-based approaches and nature-based solutions also go beyond climate mitigation and adaptation. They are interconnected with other key issues such as sustainable agriculture, the provision of clean air and water, green infrastructure, and urban green spaces. As the fifth edition of the GBO5 reports, transformations need to be achieved in the production of goods and services, especially food. This includes adopting agricultural methods that can meet growing global demand while imposing fewer negative impacts on the environment and reducing the pressure to convert more land to production. It also means limiting the demand for increased food production by adopting healthier diets, reducing food waste, and addressing the consumption of other material goods and services affecting biodiversity. The deployment of green infrastructure and making space for nature within built landscapes to improve the health and quality of life for citizens also needs to be factored. Here we must recognize the dependency of urban communities on well-functioning ecosystems. Teleconnections between cities and nearby and distant ecosystems, and spatial planning to reduce the negative impacts on biodiversity from urban expansion, roads, and other infrastructure are critical for a green cities and infrastructure transition. So in closing, looking ahead, it will be critical for nature-based solutions to leverage broad action, recognizing the value of biodiversity and enhancing or restoring the functionality of ecosystems on which all aspects of human activity depend. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very rich contribution. I think you show that actually it can be quite a technical issue in relation to how this is applied. And I won't ask you to comment on this, but I think you are dropping us quite a strong hint that nature-based solutions might well still be in the 1.0 draft that is coming. Welcome that, obviously. So thanks for that. And no doubt there's going to be questions, but now we will move on to Norbert, who's going to be talking about nature-based solutions for accelerating transformative change in mainstreaming biodiversity and strengthening synergies amongst the multilateral environmental agreements. Norbert, please.
Karina's intervention showed how technical that environmental policy can be. My title shows how abstract it can be. It contains 4 terms that in itself are quite abstract. Synergies, mainstreaming, the nature-based solution as such, and the transformative change. I would like to start with transformative change and recall when in 2016 in the outer skirt of Geneva, we had the first Bossé meeting, and we were reflecting what comes after 2020, the post-2020, when the IG targets will phase out and the strategic plan that we adopted some years earlier. And at that time, I remember that the then executive secretary of the CBD said, we need something that makes pollution or to disregard nature unmoral or immoral, how do you say? It's like smoking. She always said we have to achieve that in society, it is not accepted that somebody pollutes nature. And we tried to give this idea a name, and came up already 5 years ago with this transformative change. Probably in Jane's mind and discussion, this existed already, but for me it was the first time that I heard this transformative change. And I was quite pleased when I read the IPBES global assessment, where transformative change again has a very prominent place in it. And it clearly states that we have to make sure that our production and our consumption is not harmful for nature. And this is easily said and everybody agrees on it, but it hurts. It hurts when you imagine how we produce many of our products, how we consume, how we travel, how we live. It almost always is linked with a negative impact on nature. So if governments should now stand up and say, okay, we have to change our behavior, we have to change our ways of producing and consume things, then people they might feel it. They will not necessarily be very happy about that. And I always remember when President Macron in France, he took office, one of his first measures he wanted to introduce was to raise the gas price, because he said climate change needs that we are more responsible using the car and shift towards public transport. And what he saw was the reaction of the yellow vests. So transformative change is something that, as I said, that hurt, and needs a lot of planning, a lot of political will to make sure that we are ready to shift from the way how we produce things, how we consume, to more sustainable and in harmony with nature. Now, nature-based solutions was for me a kind of an answer to what I clearly felt in the discussion in the climate change. Many countries, they were exactly afraid of a transformative change. So they wanted to focus on technology. So not change your behavior, but just develop a new technology so that you can continue your normal consumption and your normal production and your traveling and your production of food. Just focus on a technology answer in it. And sometimes it's true. I've been visiting a year ago a factory near Zurich that is taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere and produces kerosene. So there would be a kind of circular economy for our planes. It is possible. You need a lot of energy, of electric energy, but it is possible. So technology can be a part of the answer. But sometimes it is certainly not the right way to go. And I always remember in Paris when we adopted the Paris Agreement, my neighbor was from Suriname. Swiss and Suriname, we are neighbors. And he told me that in Suriname, they have a problem that a lot of sediment that comes from the Amazon River is the waves going into the land and of Suriname. And so he had an idea of planting mangroves, and the mangroves would hold back the sediments, and the kind of natural dam would grow up. When more sediments come, the mangrove would grow on the top of it. But his government wanted to build a dam with concrete. And it was clearly linked to economy, to business partners, to an approach of technicians who don't really listen to nature, but who come up with some technical, often concrete and with a heavy impact on nature. So this was for me an eye-opener, and I said, really, we have to learn again something that that our ancestors knew, and that also the indigenous people still know. So if Lucy today cannot be with us, I think it's also something we also owe tribute to the indigenous people who they know what at the long term nature can offer us, and how we can use nature in order to not have a strong impact, even if we want to have the economy going well. Now, the resistance came, as has been said also by Jane, from the biodiversity community. And you mentioned the you mentioned the example of the eucalyptus monoculture plantation to absorb CO2. Catalina was mentioning it. Of course, this is not the right approach, and therefore I am very happy that IUCN developed not only a methodology on how to use these nature-based solutions, but also standards. And I'm glad that our experts have done it, because I can imagine, and Catalina as well, if we would have to negotiate these standards, we would need 5 more years to agree on standards among negotiators. So we should be happy if experts within bodies like IUCN, they can have a very rational approach to it and can offer their findings to the processes like the CBD. Now, the mainstreaming is something that Mexico was pushing at their COP we had some years ago in Cancun, and it is quite evident that we cannot save biodiversity by creating protected areas. The impact, and DEPA's global assessment also showed it, the impact on biodiversity comes from different sectors, and we have to address biodiversity concerns within these sectors. So mainstreaming has become something very important, but it's still an uphill struggle. And I recall the anecdote of Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the now CEO of Jeff. When he took the plane, he met a minister of the Costa Rican government, and he asked him where he was heading to. Are you heading to a CBD conference? And the Minister for Agriculture said, oh no, I will go to the UNFCCC meeting. And for him, it was also an eye-opener that many ministers from other sectors, they attend climate change COPs, but not necessarily biodiversity COPs. Even if probably we would need their understanding, their collaboration much more, because as it has been said, these impacts come from other sectors, so we have to integrate these sectors. But why is it like this? I think it is like this because climate change is, first of all, direct. The economic impact is very evident. Biodiversity, it's more difficult to understand that at the end there is also a price tag on the destruction of nature. And the second argument is something that is a fact, that we have one UNFCCC process, but we have many other MEAs that deal with biodiversity. It's always a little bit the diversity of the biodiversity world that looks like a spring meadow with a lot of flowers. And that's certainly nice, and it's a fact, but we have to agree that ministers will not attend many of the COPs because there are so many processes that they cannot attend all of them. And at the end, visibility and political agenda setting is still difficult for the biodiversity world. So we have to work together, and this is the last term, that synergies means that we work together with all the MEAs that can contribute to the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And as it has been said, this is not only the biodiversity-related conventions, but also others like climate, but we also heard that it has an impact on agriculture, on health. So FAO is also, of course, in the boat. And synergies will bring all these MEAs together, and hopefully we will be able within the COP to adopt a mechanism that allows all the MEAs to contribute to it and also to report on it. It's very important that we create a platform where all this information can be put on one platform, is transparent and doesn't need more reporting. We just put all the reports in the different processes on one platform, and this allows us to see how synergetically we can implement the new Global Biodiversity Framework all together in an integrative manner. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you so much, Norbert. And I think it's really important that you emphasize the transformative change in relation to mainstreaming, because I think nature-based solutions could really help with that. And I'd also remark that although, of course, the Global Biodiversity Framework's got to be a work of science, it's also got to be a work of art. And if it does, it truly will allow the other MEAs to see themselves in there and contribute to it and report against it. And I actually think it will help the CBD as kind of the leader in this game to help push it, help get implementation, help everybody take it seriously. So thanks very much for those remarks. So now let's go to Camila Zipada-Lizama, Director General of Global Issues at the Mexican Secretariat of Foreign Relations. She's going to talk about nature-based solutions, an integrated response for achieving the 2050 vision. Quite a big thought there. Over to you, Camilla.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you to the Geneva Environment Network and the government of Switzerland for carrying out this event. I feel extremely honored to be counted as among such prestigious and committed panelists. And following up on the discussion, Catalina has already mentioned the technical part, and Norbert, the abstract science and the state of art. And so now I will focus on the political will needed and the public policies needed to foster nature-based solutions. And so I hope to shed some light into some of the work that the government of Mexico, and more importantly, our subnational governments are carrying out to fully implement all this post-2020 biodiversity framework, and specifically nature-based solutions. And as such, you might have heard already about the Edinburgh Declaration. And in that sense, we're happy to say that since Mexico has been advocating for an essential role of cities and local authorities within the implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity, we were the first party to sign this declaration. And we believe it is a very powerful instrument to enhance and collectively increase ambition for the post-2020 implementation. And we're currently working with them. I can't already say many specifics because it's under construction, but we do seek to promote collaboration and capacity development among our subnational governments, cities and local authorities. We're working with them to present some additional commitments and on how we can have this participative mechanism to strengthen environmental governments within different sectors and stakeholders. And more importantly, we're searching on innovative financial mechanisms that could bring multilateral cooperation, attention, and also co-finance interest to develop successful conservation and restoration projects that do include nature-based solutions. And this has been a specific obstacle that we have seen across the world, is that it's easy to get funding for federal governments. Well, not easy, but at least there is funding for federal governments. But that task is incredibly harder for local authorities to have those financial resources that are needed, mainly because a lot of their cities and their authorities are the ones that are actually implementing in the ground nature-based solutions. So we need also to have that sort of alignment between multilateral agencies, between regional development banks, and then local authorities to streamline those resources. And in the end, if we want to fulfill those Edinburgh Declaration goals, well, we need the resources to go to those projects. And as mentioned in the beginning, Mexico is a very strong supporter of nature-based solutions, and any plans also related to an ecosystem-based approach to ensure respect for nature. We have been very vocal on it on all of the multilateral agenda. Particularly last year, we co-shared with Canada and led an action track of nature-based solutions on the Global Commission on Adaptation, which was a one-year period effort that culminated in the Adaptation Summit that happened last January. And within this framework, we organized a dialogue of indigenous peoples, climate change, biodiversity, and desertification, with a special focus on nature-based solutions to delve in how indigenous people perceived, and as you said, they have a very different definition than we do. And for them, everything is a nature-based solution and should be a nature-based solution approach. And this was a very interesting dialogue whose results we are presenting to each of the 3 Rio conventions, as we believe we need to follow up and make sure, as has already been mentioned, to have those synergies between the 3 different conventions and not just mention it in the CBD discussions and negotiations, but we need to bring the nature-based solutions focus, and that it is helpful for all climate and environmental related matters. And so we are very happy to see that, as you said, Jane, this catchy word of nature-based solutions have been now gaining attention. And for example, in the G20 Italian presidency's initiative, there has been a strong support for nature-based solution in global climate actions. So not only the biodiversity and the environment track, but also within the climate working group, there has been an effort to include nature-based solutions as a way to tackle climate change. So we're very happy to see now that further engagement. But we do believe that now we have these ideas in the multilateral agenda. We need to make sure that they go into the ground, that they go into public policies, and that all the legal frameworks are aligned. So in that sense, I'm happy to say that, for example, in Mexico, we have included nature-based solutions as a very strong part of our NDC, our National Determined Contribution for the UNFCCC framework. And also we have incorporated nature-based solutions in our national adaptation policy, and it's also contained in our general law of climate change. So we are aiming at generating specific concrete actions. I mean, Norbert has already mentioned about mangroves. I mean, that's a huge project in Mexico. I mean, I don't need to repeat. I think everyone here understands that power. But so definitely we see that there are very opportunities to scale up these solutions to restore ecosystem and habitats, land soil recovery, carbon capture and storage, and all of those, also poverty reduction. And so we're very happy that nature-based solutions are gaining momentum, and we do believe that it is fundamental to create the synergies that we have been mentioning. And in that sense, it is helpful that from our part, and I'm happy to say that my office specifically covers all the 3 Rio conventions. And so we have been very vocal on bringing this idea across the 3 Rio conventions and making sure that it gets the attention it deserves, and that we believe it is a good way forward for all the global challenges that we face. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Camilla, and thanks for stressing the important role of Indigenous peoples and their viewpoints in relation to this debate, you know, where Mexico often takes such a great lead, and we always appreciate that. Thank you. In addition, you mentioned the importance of, you know, reaching city dwellers, including through innovative financial mechanisms. So I think that's another piece of the puzzle, really, and you know, which speaks to what Norbert mentioned about, you know, how do we reach the wider public who don't necessarily want to stop consuming and all the rest of it, or don't necessarily see the importance of that. But you covered many issues there. Thank you very much for that. So now let's move on to Corley. Paulie Pretorius from UNEP WCMC, who's going to be talking about the UN Common Approach on Biodiversity and Nature-Based Solutions. Paulie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane, and good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. Many thanks to the Geneva Environment Network for organizing this series and inviting me to this panel today also. I would like to share 3 insights about the UN Common Approach to Biodiversity, and if you will forgive me, this happens when you later down in the panel discussion, I'm going to pick up on things that Camilla mentioned, Norbert mentioned, Catalina mentioned, so I think we are very much in alignment, and also what you said in the beginning to open the session, Jane. The common approach that we have adopted, or that the chief executives or the executive heads of the agencies adopted at the spring meeting of the CEB, is really a mainstreaming agenda, and it's also about the UN system support to member states to implement the CBD and other multilateral environmental agreements. So the 3 things that I would like to highlight. Firstly, reflect on the SG's vision and leadership by requesting a whole of UN system approach to biodiversity, and therefore also signaling the need for supporting integrated approaches across governments. Secondly, focus on the implementation at the national level, but at the same time, identify key systemic levers or barriers to change. And thirdly, appreciate that the integration of biodiversity and nature-based approaches also require the phasing out of economic activity that degrades nature. And this is what Norbert has also spoken about, the transitions, those socio-economic transitions. But let's start with the whole of UN system and the whole of government approach. As we know, biodiversity underpins our economies and our well-being. It ensures sustainable livelihoods, supports 1.2 billion jobs directly, billions more indirectly. And studies show that half of the world's global economy is moderately or highly dependent on functioning ecosystems. And conversely, as Catalina said, when these are degraded or they unravel, it has enormous social impact on different communities in a very differentiated way. Among many recent assessments, the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, released in September last year, also indicated that the global ambition to address the 3 pillars of sustainable development is limited by siloed approaches, where the value of biodiversity and ecosystem services are largely unaccounted and disconnected from socio-economic priorities. That's the first message that is also captured in the UN Common Approach to Biodiversity, is that we require actions across the whole of government and society to address nature loss and to integrate biodiversity considerations and nature-based solutions. These will help us to address the direct and underlying causes of biodiversity loss and help us with that transformation of our economies, set us on a different pathway. Secondly, the focus on implementation and the identification of key system levers, as Camilla said, really important to get to all tiers of government in terms of the implementation. Through the common approach, the UN system expressed a shared recognition of the urgency to act and a commitment to mainstream through better coordinated efforts to facilitate implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, but also linked to the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. For example, we have not only the sectoral or across sectors integration, we also looked at vertical coherence. UN country teams and UN residence coordinators will support member states to implement the decisions of multilateral environmental agreements. And there are various instruments that we have as UN teams to do so, looking at supporting policy coherence, institutional capacity, but also things such as multi-stakeholder processes and brokering those difficult ways forward where we need to bring different economic interests together. There are also larger systemic issues to address, which are part of our global system. For example, markets, economic, and financial practices need to be fundamentally reformed to consider biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Such reform includes using metrics for governments and the private sector and society that measure progress towards sustainable development and that are supported by strengthened commitments to conserve and restore natural capital. And these are some of the dialogues that the UN can convene, bringing different parts of our global institutional architecture together as well. There was also a key message in the 2020 Human Development Report that now is the time for all countries to redesign their paths to progress by fully accounting for the pressures human puts on the planet and by working towards activities that generate a net positive effect on nature. And this is exactly the third message. Those socio-economic transitions that Norbert referred to, they are required to reset our relationship with nature. These transitions require proactive support of green economy approaches, creating decent jobs and ecosystem resilience. And by doing so, also ensuring disaster risk reduction, including those related to environmental change and pandemics. And I think Angela might speak to that. Your guidance that you've put out, Jane, is really full of practical examples on how some of nature-based solutions can be applied to achieve this. One example that was also referenced by Catalina earlier is the current unsustainability of our food systems. And thinking about what Camilla said and Norbert about the synergies across the different conventions, food systems are associated with many of the direct drivers of biodiversity loss through land use change, large-scale monoculture of a handful of major food crops, overexploitation of fisheries, the impacts of excess nutrients, use of chemicals, food waste and loss, generation of greenhouse gases. So these, if you can imagine, bringing all of those systemic challenges together, this is what we mean when we're talking about transformation of systems. The socioeconomic transitions will also require changing societal perceptions. So we depend as much on the producers as on the consumers to drive this change. And as consumers, societies, we need to value and conserve biodiversity. In the world of work, skills for a greener future remain a priority. And that needs to influence our education and our reskilling programs as well. These might include skills to accelerate the energy transition and the transformation of other extractive sectors, to create resilience through natural resource management, and very importantly, in the next decade, we have a big emphasis on ecosystem restoration, of course. In closing, we are now in a moment in history to reflect on cooperation and the choices we need to make to tackle these global systemic risks and challenges, and how our societies can be reshaped as part of a resilient and sustainable recovery from the pandemic. As the UN system, through the common approach, we have to design the outlines of collective action and cooperation across sectors to support member states to achieve just that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Corley. I think you've painted quite a vision there. I've got lots of questions, but I'm not going to ask them right now because but thank you very much for that. It's very, very thought-provoking. And as you pointed out, I think these presentations are very nicely complementing each other. We've got a very big picture painted. But now let's hear from Angela Andrade, who is chair of IUCN's Commission on Ecosystem Management, on the ecosystem approach and nature-based solutions. And I believe that she's going to be picking up on some of the interesting discussions that have taken place around the issue of nature-based solutions that I mentioned at the beginning. And well, I, for one, I'm very much looking forward to hearing where the rubber hits the road on all this. So over to you, Angela. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I thought that I missed the connection, but yeah. So I have a very a short presentation. So the first point that I wanted to highlight is that as we all know, the ecosystem approach was adopted by the Convention on Biological Diversity in the year 2000. And one of the main of the purposes of the ecosystem approach, as was already highlighted by Jane and by some of you, is the importance of addressing in an integrated manner the objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And after the ecosystem approach was adopted, the Commission on Ecosystem Management, together with the IUCN and many other organizations, started with the development of some practical applications of the ecosystem approach. And we have applications to different areas, to different sectors. We have a lot of experiences, for example, in ecosystem-based approaches to fisheries, to human health. But since 2008, the approach that was mainly known, and it was already referred by some of you, was the ecosystem-based approaches to climate change adaptation. And as we all know, these applications have been very popular and have been mainstream in many areas. And we all know these days about the extent to which ecosystem-based approaches can contribute to address climate change impacts. However, all these applications, and that's one of the main comments that we have for many people, that the ecosystem approach seemed to be quite technical and difficult to understand, especially for people outside the conservation community. And so, as we all know, the ecosystem approach provides very good scientific basis and understanding of the connections between ecosystems and societies, including culture and all these topics. One important point to consider is the difficulty that we had during these years to really use this concept and for mainstreaming and engaging other people, especially the private sector and people in areas outside the conservation community. So this is one of the reasons of why the whole concept of nature-based solutions became so, let's say, popular. And as we know, it's a kind of operational approach to address the global societal challenges. And this definition, as was mentioned already, was adopted by IUCN members in 2016. So that means that there are almost 20 years between the adoption of the ecosystem approach and the definition and nature-based solutions. What I want to highlight is that they are complementary. They are not replacing one to each other because they have different backgrounds. They have different objectives, and we still have the ecosystem approach producing a lot of research, literature, and applications. But the main topic that I want to highlight regarding nature-based solutions is the need to address all these challenges in an integrated manner, because we have, and that has been recalled by some of you, we are living in a very urgent situation where biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation, and climate change are becoming one of the main challenges that we ever had, and we need to respond in an integrated manner immediately, let's say. So this approach provides a practical way to introduce all this ecosystem approach thinking to solve these problems and really to build this a community of practice on the implementation on nature-based solutions. We can go to the first next one, please. So all the next slide, the definitions that I presented here are not they are not alone. No, they are not coming alone. They are they come together with a set of principles, and as it has been highlighted already, also by Jane and others, the NBS approach is built upon the good experiences coming from the applications of the ecosystem approach, ecosystem-based approaches and other related actions like ecosystem restoration, like forest landscape restoration, but most importantly, the importance of considering hybrid approaches, because this is where these kind of conservation-related actions are connecting with other actions that have been implemented by other agencies, where we need to build these bridges. So as you can see, the principles that we have, and this is part of the analysis that gave rise to the application of the standard, show that not all the principles are identical, because the principles of the nature-based solutions highlight I would say three that are mainly related to topics that were not so explicit with previous approaches, like the topic of the importance of having an impact on policies. And when we discuss this, we are talking about local policies, sectorial policies, any kind of policies, even global policies, as was already mentioned. We also consider the topic of synergies, that is very important, and also the trade-offs that was already mentioned. But in this case, we understand that we have ecological trade-offs as well as social trade-offs. So this topic is extremely important, and we need to make sure that we are addressing the problem in an integrated manner, because the experiences that we have so far have been quite fragmented. And this is the main concern when we were discussing the relevance of implementing the nature-based solutions approach. The need to have a connection at landscape level, because usually in many cases, these approaches in the field are only focused on one specific topic. Some ecosystem services are addressed. For example, for climate change adaptation, we mainly refer to some specific ecosystem services. But at the end, the integrity at landscape level is what matters, because we need to have these synergies at scale, and we need to have all the stakeholders involved in this process of negotiation of what are the impacts if we implement one action or the other. So, so this is why I think this is there is a valid, an added value from the nature-based solutions approach that is not replacing in any way the ecosystem approach. I want to insist on that, because in the negotiations we have seen many concerns about this. So, and finally, the next one, please. So, as presented, the NBS principles allow for the integration of solutions at landscape, for landscape planning and policy coherence in one single framework. So the global standard that was developed by IUCN and with a strong participation of the Commission on Ecosystem Management, IUCN members who were consulted, many people from the Secretariat. This is a collective effort in order to set a common basis of understanding of what nature-based solutions are, and to provide a robust framework to design, assess, improve, and scale up and scale out nature-based solutions to better address societal challenges. And it has been mentioned already, the importance of nature-based solutions as a tool for scaling up this transformational change needed. We believe that this tool can really help us to address not all let's say, the conservation commitments that we have, because we have a lot of experience on that. We are concerned about what's happening outside of the protected areas and the areas in which we have invested many years in conservation. So we completely agree that it's very important to consolidate a high percentage of protected areas, but we see that nature-based solutions is the best tool to address the remaining 70%. So the most relevant criteria, and you can see the importance of the standard is that we established 8 criteria with about 36 indicators. But what is important is that all these criteria have to be addressed simultaneously, because in a way that we can address several societal challenges at the same time, not only one, because as I explained before, addressing only one challenge may increase trade-offs and consequences in the long term. So so I want to highlight that some of the most relevant criteria are related to landscape approaches. That means that nature-based solutions should be seen as a continuum in the territory. The management of trade-offs is another important criteria, the incidence in policies, and it was mentioned already, the importance of addressing social and biodiversity trade-offs. I want to conclude by mentioning the importance also to consider that when we were talking about biodiversity gains or biodiversity requirements, we are talking about biodiversity gains, as was mentioned by Jane at the beginning, but also the need to promote or to achieve ecosystem integrity. This is another important topic that is included. And this is why we internally in the Commission and with many other people are also advocating for the relevance of having an ecosystem goal in the post-2020 framework, because it's extremely, if we really have this goal on ecosystems, we can really connect and interact with the standard, with the ecosystem-based approaches. And so far we have we are proposing a theory of change to achieve this ecosystem goal that should include components like area integrity and the risk of collapse. And there is where we connect this nature-based solutions standard with the red list of ecosystems assessment, which is an additional contribution to the work that IUCN has done for many years, highlighting the relevance of considering the one ecosystem goal. So we hope with this that the standard that provides a common understanding and interpretation across sectors, geographies, that we can really ensure a systematic learning framework to improve and evolve applications, provide quality control in the design and execution of interventions, minimize risks related to unsustainable use of nature, use existing relevant tools. As we said, we are not reinventing the wheel. We are really building on experiences and science previously developed, but specifically oriented to achieve these goals. And we are also aiming to create a global user community, including different sectors, and at the end, contribute to a shared vision for a just and sustainable world. Thank you, Jane. And that's it now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving us that sort of extra technical background and the context and the wide vision, if you like, represented by nature-based solutions. And I think it is helpful to see the evolution of where this has come from and really how this piece, if you like, is kind of more helpful than some of the other bits. It speaks more widely to the public, and it's more intuitively understandable as long as we get it right. Now, we have some time for questions, which is excellent, and we've got some very rich questions in the chat. The first one I'm going to ask to probably all of you, and then I'm going to sort of take them one by one according to who I think might be the best person to answer. So the first one I think is quite an obvious one that we hoped will be asked, and of course it's that, you know, within the CBD negotiations so far we've seen some pushback on the issue of nature-based solutions. And another questioner refers to the fact that the recent summit in Cornwall didn't want to include nature-based solutions in the communique, the G7 summit. So what can we do about that right now, given time is so limited and we'll soon be heading into the key political negotiation for the Global Biodiversity Framework? So I'm going to ask you all for your thoughts on that, and then we've got some other interesting questions. But let me start with Catalina. Can you share some advice with us on what we might be able to do, or what you might be doing about that from the Secretariat point of view of the CBD?
Thank you, Jane, and thank you to those asking those questions. I think it's definitely one that we have been seeing in the negotiations. We do realize that not only in the CBD context, but also in New York, in several of the discussions addressing the Rio conventions, especially CBD, the term nature-based solution has been kind of controversial, despite the fact that nature-based solutions has been adopted in the context of the climate convention. It was one of the elements of the Secretary General's Climate Action Summit in 2019. So there is a political recognition of that term within the context of the climate process. In terms of the CBD, I think Angela did mention a bit of the evolution of how in the CBD context, we use the term ecosystem-based approaches. And in the context of referring to climate adaptation and mitigation, we used ecosystem-based approaches for climate adaptation and mitigation purposes, with a lot of decisions and guidance that already exist via the parties and many of the constituencies that have followed the COP discussions. My recommendation would be that when using the reference to nature-based solutions, we also explain how the CBD has been approaching this through the term ecosystem-based approaches, and providing examples that not only address the context under climate change, but also, as mentioned previously, that describe these type of approaches, activities towards the sustainable development agenda. In which case we know that solutions coming from ecosystems and from nature are well placed in SDG 2 on agriculture, SDG 11 on climate change itself, the SDGs on infrastructure, and many others. We also, I think, there are aspects where we need to operationalize and explain again the different tools that the CBD has developed, and demonstrate how this has been used by countries as well as at the local level, so that there's more reference about what is being explained and how it's applicable in the context of the CBD, as well as understanding how the term is being defined by IUCN and other partners, not only for the context of climate change, but also how it's applicable for the post-2020 framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So who else would like to comment on the answer to this question, or give us, or those listening to this, any advice on how it might be further pushed? I mean, one thing perhaps I will say to Corley is maybe we need to explain how your big vision aligns to the nature-based solution standard of IUCN. And I don't know if that piece of work has been done, but that might also help. Did you make a comment on that, Corley?
Well, yeah, I can make a comment on that. I mean, it is not, I don't think that it would implement anything other than that. It's not sort of going off into a different standard or a different direction. It's really in providing the institutional support and the capacity to deliver on this on the ground. That's the one part. And the other part is connecting the dots. So making sure that you also bring nature-based solutions beyond the environment sector to make it relevant to agriculture, as Catalina said, to make it relevant across the different SDGs. And that is sort of the purpose of the mainstreaming approach.
Right. So maybe I think we need to see a sort of route towards making this acceptable to governments and others who perhaps this is still a new concept to. Maybe we all need to explain it all a little bit about how it all aligns, and reassure people that it's not a greenwash, to be direct. Reassure people that it it doesn't do harm. It does good, and it does good for people at the same time as doing good for biodiversity. I mean, I'm putting it deliberately very, very simply because it's a technical subject, but we need to make it accessible to people. Who else would like to comment on this?
If I can come in,
please.
Thank you. And well, as the lead negotiator in these conventions and in G20, I have just seen that that pushback. But I mean, in every convention, in every negotiation, at some point, a concept has been new, and not because it hasn't been yet discussed, we can't put it in the table. I mean, if not, then we would never advance. And so, I mean, that I don't believe it's a valid argument on going forward that just simply because we haven't agreed yet, then we shouldn't incorporate it. And it's just, we need to, as they are pushing back, then we need to push forward. I mean, in every field, it's making sure that, as you said, we are showing the benefits of nature-based solutions. We're showing with concrete examples what we mean by nature-based solutions, and then put on the table then a definition for us to work on. But if we don't even ask it, then it will never get agreed. So it's just, again, insist in every forum on what we see that nature-based solutions are and what is the value added of this concept. Just
brilliant. I think that's great advice, actually, because everything was new once. So I think, you know, to keep insisting and also explaining. Any other comments on this question?
Yes, if I may, Jane?
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think the question is important, and well, I would respond based on my experience in some projects, especially regarding ecosystem-based adaptation. For example, I've been one of the main advocates for promoting ecosystem-based adaptation to address climate change. But what I've seen, and that was discussed a couple of years ago in the climate change discussions, or regarding the contributions of EBA, and some of the main challenges that we identify is, for example, to highlight the connection with biodiversity, because in many cases, and I want to insist that this is one of the, I wouldn't say failures, but the limitations of applying these ecosystem-based approaches without this integrated picture. So the projects or these initiatives didn't have the possibility to deliver or to results on biodiversity, for example, because in many cases they have been seen as let's say like some benefits or co-benefits, but not embedded in the definition. So, and in many cases, if you see a territory, the area in which the ecosystem-based adaptation project was implemented, lack of connection with other land use activities. So this is something that I think that the NBS standard provides a tool to link and to integrate, because it's not just about nature-based solutions for climate. We have in the definition nature-based solutions for human health, for water provision, for agriculture, and the ideal situation is to have all these challenges addressed in an integrated manner, not just say now and starting using the language nature-based solutions for climate, nature-based solutions for agriculture, because then we are again fragmenting the responses. And this is one of the topics that we would like to avoid, and in which I think that the NBS standard contributes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's an important point to stress, really. This fully integrated approach, which I think the UN, whole of UN approach is also aiming to achieve. So just moving on, how do we implement nature-based solutions on the ground level? I mean, that's quite a technical question. And I think the best thing to do there is And I mean, Angela, I don't know if you could give a short answer to that, but there's a lot of information on the IUCN website, isn't there? And including, you know, a sort of guide to the standard and how to implement it. Could you give us a sort of short piece of advice on that for the questioner who asked that question?
Yeah, well, it's important to highlight that the NBS standard is, let's say, the main audience for the nature-based solutions standard includes the policy level, something that is we expect to get a commitment and from the policy sector, making sure that the nature-based solutions standard is adopted at policy level as well. That is something that it refers to one of the criteria, and in most of the other previous approaches that I mentioned, is not visible in that way. So I think that that's one important contribution. Another one is and it's another component of the audience is the private sector, because as I mentioned, we aim to engage them, to make them part of this web of connections. And the final one is, let's say, the traditional one, the one that is related to projects and actions that are in many cases developed and sponsored by the GF and other multilateral or bilateral cooperation. So because at the end, what we aim is to have NBS adopted at landscape level, we need to engage everyone. We cannot just focus in only one component or only one stakeholder. We need to have all of them in the sitting together in the table and discussing about these trade-offs and making sure that all the decisions are shared and discussed with all the participants.
Great, thank you. So, I mean, building on what you say there, and this relates to another question, you know, pointing out that, I mean, we're speaking in English, and the reach of English in the world is only so far. Will there be a big multilingual capacity building effort or a mass public outreach program by IUCN and the UN? I mean, I would say this speaks to Angela's answer. If it becomes part of the post-2020 framework, this is a framework for parties to implement. But we also hope other sectors will play their part. And as Norbert has been stressing, other conventions as well. It's a framework for all, as certainly IUCN envisages it, and that's our position. Corley, would you like to add on what the UN system might be doing to push this out a little bit more to the public?
Yes, thank you, Jane. As I sort of alluded or hinted, as part of the common approach to biodiversity, there's certainly a component that relates to global advocacy and communications and outreach around mainstreaming biodiversity and nature-based solutions. So we realize that there are many parts for this to be successfully integrated or mainstreamed, and for these transitions to also find political resonance. There's a very large job to be done in reaching out to key stakeholders and audiences and make them part of the solution. I think it's important, looking at the multiple benefits of restoration and of nature-based solutions, is to be able to articulate what are those societal benefits that you can generate through applying these approaches by resetting our relationship with nature. And that, I think, there's an enormous awareness raising task in all languages and in all countries to be able to achieve this.
Thank you. I think this is the importance also of reaching city dwellers, where so many of us live these days. I would just like to ask Norbert. Norbert, you mentioned mainstreaming, obviously, and we've got a question on, you know, what would it take at the national level? I mean, perhaps not just in Switzerland, but wider. You know, how can we mainstream nature-based solutions more effectively? I mean, not just for climate change, but, you know, as Angela has pointed out, this is for all societal challenges that link to nature. Can you give us any advice?
It's a challenge. I remember the last two COPs of the CBD, they were under the title of mainstreaming biodiversity, and we didn't have any other ministers showing up. So the other ministers, they know that they will be blamed and criticized for not integrating nature and biodiversity into their policies. So it remains a challenge, but as it has been said also, the cost of inaction is probably higher than the cost of action, and this has to be integrated in policy programs. I guess that cabinets, they have to discuss this, and they have to understand that we have to have not only within the UN system, we have to have a common approach, but also within a government. We have to have this approach and to discuss among each other. And there are many ways how we can work together. In Switzerland, we have a lot of avalanches, so we know that we have to keep the trees, so that prevents landslides and snow avalanches. In my area where I grew up, they built a lot of, they straightened all the riverbeds, and they put dams against flooding. And now they understood that maintaining these dams or rebuild these dams is much more expensive than just to let land around the rivers that can be from time to time, if there is flooding, it can be underwater, but there are a lot of plants who can cope with this. And so this also protects then farms that are a little bit far away from the river. You don't necessarily need to have infrastructure. And this becomes more and more, I guess, evident in the governments, that they have to exchange among each other and first think of solutions that are in harmony with nature to talk about this nice vision 2050 of the CBD.
Great, thanks, Norbert. We're going to be counting on Switzerland to show us how it's done, I think. Okay, so this brings us to the really fun point in the afternoon or morning or the evening, wherever you are. We're going to ask each of our panelists to give us their main takeaway message, and you each have a minute. So I'm looking forward to this bit. Catalina, could we please start with you? What's your main takeaway message?
Well, thank you, Jane. I think there was many points that came up. I did want to echo a quick reflection on the last question in view of the economic analyses and the cost benefits when it comes to the different trade-offs on a landscape. But in my final point, I think the takeaway is that it is critical for the nature-based solutions operational kind of next steps to leverage broad action across all actors and sectors of society to mainstream the value of biodiversity and to enhance and restore the functionality of ecosystems on which socioeconomic activity depends. And at the same time, recognizing and reducing the negative impacts on human activity with the aim to enable a virtuous cycle, one that reduces the loss and degradation of biodiversity and enhances human well-being. So that would be my takeaway, is that balance and that necessity to really mainstream this vision to operationalize what we need to do between now and 2030 and how we get to our vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. Thank you.
Excellent. I wish we had longer for the reply, because it would be good for you to elaborate a little bit more on how that could be done at some point, but that's a really interesting answer. Thank you. Norbert, over to you. I think you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry for that. My dog was barking, so I had to mute my microphone. The dog is a symbol for someone who pays attention to nature. They feel all the different odors, and they can smell all the different.
Very important. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we will have to go a little bit back in this direction to understand nature, to feel. For me, the harmony that Catalina was mentioning has to do with balance, and balance for me means also that we should, and this is the element of the transformative change, we should not just have a GDP that focuses on money and economic value, and we should certainly not accept trade with products that are cheaper because they do not respect any social standards and they do harm to have a. We have to integrate these elements, social standards, environment standards, and when everybody respects this, then we can have a fair, free trade and competition, but only if the standards are respected. And this is something that is important for nature as such, not necessarily with nature-based solution, but for the CBD framework, I guess.
Great, thank you. I mean, that would be another interesting discussion to have, to look at the trade in import and export of threats to biodiversity, but another day perhaps. So now let's move to Camilla, please.
Thank you very much. And just on this last questions, I think that the reflection is that we need to show all this technical work that we have been doing and showcase the co-benefits of nature-based solutions and value added, as this will be key to make sure that all of these different forces that are pushing back against nature-based solutions, that they see that we're not meaning greenwashing a concept, but that actually this contributes for the ultimate purpose, which is to tackle climate change and reduce our loss of biodiversity and loss of desertification. And in that sense, financial resources are needed, and because they are needed, we need to make sure that they go to the most cost-effective solutions, and we do believe that nature-based solutions are such. And so now it's up to us to make sure that we are sort of attracting private investment and public investment towards this, and only with concrete examples and with real evidence we will make it so. So that's an important step going forward.
Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely agree with all that, certainly. Corley, please.
Thank you, Jane. At the very UN-esque, at the UN Biodiversity Summit last year, the message was, the next decade is our last chance to transform our relationship with nature. And it's not to be a sort of doomsday, but we are really now reaching levels of degradation that is putting our economies and our financial system, livelihoods, social fabric at risk. So the next decade, very much along what Catalina said, is the decade where we need to transform our societies. More of the good stuff, more nature-based solutions, more integrated approaches, and less of the harmful stuff that's degrading nature, whether in your own country or through those supply chains in other countries. So there's a lot of work that we can do around that, raising awareness, transparency, but also investing in the more sustainable solutions. So it's a job for all of us. It's not someone else's job. It's not someone else's business. Each of us can play a role in that.
No, thank you for that. And I'm glad you said all that, because actually sometimes we have to convince ourselves to keep saying it. And sometimes we get tired of ourselves saying it, but we have to keep saying it and we have to keep plugging away. So I'm really glad you said all that. Thank you. Angela, finally, please, last but by no means least. What is your 1 minute takeaway?
I was muted. Well, I would say, and perhaps repeat, that the ecosystem approach and ecosystem-based approaches and nature-based solutions are not competing. They complement one to each other and provide scientific and operational tools to achieve the transformational change, as was mentioned. And nature-based solutions is really a very good tool and has a strong potential to grow and to reach the relevance of ecosystem-based approaches at landscape level, seeking for integration. I want to insist on that, promoting and integrating ecosystem-based actions in the field, minimizing trade-offs, and promoting the existence of sustainable and resilient territories. So we are with a new standard, and we really hope that this can contribute to establish communities of practice beyond conservation and reaching out really sectors such as agriculture, human health, and and cities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're just about bang on time. So let me thank all of our panelists for some really interesting and thought-provoking presentations. And I think they've all complemented each other beautifully. And I've certainly learned a lot. So it's been great. And I think we've got to all keep going and show how nature-based solutions can contribute to a nature-positive, climate-neutral, equitable world. And now I'll hand back to Diana. Thank you. Thanks to our audience, I should add.
Yes, thanks to our audience, thanks to our panelists, and thanks to our moderator. Thank you very much, Jane. I just wanted to add a few words on the next steps in our journey. And as you will see in the next slide, the next session will be, we have done some accommodations to the series, and the next session will be in August with our colleagues from the International Labour Organization, where we will be discussing socio-economic growth and nature-based solutions. I also want to mention here, as you will see in the next slide, that this is part of a journey with many more sessions, and you can find more information on the website. Also, all the outcomes of these sessions, the summaries, the videos, everything, and the links of the documents that were presented, everything is being made available on the website.